everybody. Welcome back. We are here continuing on the journey of our, YouTube channel and show. I've been bringing you many different people that are talking about a variety of different things. We focused the last 2 weeks on health and nutrition. And this week we have a very special guest, which is a dear friend and colleague of mine. Dr.Talee Vang is here with us. She is going to introduce herself, but also we're going to dig really deep into a topic that I think that our community needs to talk and hear about. We're going to talk a little bit about xenophobia right now in the face of COVID. And then we're going to talk about the relationships between different diverse groups in this country and abroad, and some of the major issues that the media is tending to highlight right now. So we want to uncover some of that and peel back the layers on some of these issues. Dr. Vang, can you talk to our audience a little bit about who you are, what you do, and let's dive right into this conversation.
All right. Thank you for having me, by the way. So I am a psychologist. I'm a clinical psychologist. I practice in the Midwest area out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am a primary care behavioral health psychologist. And Hmong American woman. I would say I'm a 1.5 generation refugee from Thailand, but identify as Hmong. Right now, I practice out of a hospital system in primary care, and have been doing a lot of work in my own community, in the Hmong community, and also in the greater Minneapolis community, addressing things like anxiety, coping with anxiety, especially in the wake of this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then also talking a little bit about racism or ways to disarm racism for a lot of people who may be experiencing that right now.
Wow, can you just break down a little bit about what is the intricacies of being part of the Hmong community and sort of like the diversity that exists among the Asian American community and Pacific Island community? Because a lot of times, like, we talk about it like this is monolithic sort of thing, like everyone is the same. And I think that sometimes that's like the biggest offense, right? Like generally sweeping, saying like, oh, everyone's Chinese, and not really taking time to consider the significant cultural differences and ethnic differences within and diversity within the Asian American community. So can you just educate us a little bit on that so that we are kind of on your page and clear around that definition?
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point. So, I mean, Asians are usually just lumped into one, Asians, right? So there's been a lot of fight, I think, especially over the last several years, to really recognize the differences in different Asian cultural groups. You have some of the East Asian cultures like Japanese, Chinese, you have Southeast Asian, like, Lao, Thai, Vietnamese, and then you have Pacific Islanders, you have East Indians, you have so many different Asian groups, meaning different cultures, different ways that we see life, different religions and histories. And so something that is really, really present for me is that the different cultures within the Asian category has a very, very different history, trauma histories, migration histories. And so specifically pertaining to the Hmong culture and the Hmong community, the Hmong people originated out of China. And so when the Chinese emperor at that time wanted to unify all of China, the Hmong people resisted and fought against that kind of unification because they wanted their own, sovereignty, really. And so they fought the Chinese emperor at that time and did not succeed. And so then started to migrate down to Southeast Asia. And so lived in Laos, Vietnam, other parts of Asia. Some people stayed in China. And so really started this separation or, of just the Hmong community. And so, for my roots and my lineage, we moved from China down to Laos, and then after the Vietnam War, which is another historical trauma that happened in the Hmong community, moved to Thailand and as refugees, where I was eventually born in the refugee camp. And then from there, even more, the diaspora spread throughout the globe. So you have Hmong people in Australia, France, the U.S., Canada, South America, all over, really.
Right. So there was sort of like this, cultural exchange that ended up happening where the Hmong people then started to move into different places in the world, but you still strongly identify ethnically with that. I mean, and it's funny because you touched on like just not just in terms of nationality, like whether you were born in Singapore or Taiwan or China, or Japan, but also like the different governmental regimes and different societal norms for each of the Asian groups, right? That again, I think that if you're not familiar or orientated to the differences, you think that it's all the same.
Right.
And
Yes.
how do you respond to people when you think about that? And I'm going to tie it to the way that this has kind of played out in COVID, but that, when we have kind of like a perception of a certain group, how does that really play out?
Can you kind of rephrase that question for me?
Yeah. So if I'm kind of throwing everybody into the same pot and I'm saying, oh, all Asians are alike, right? Or this virus is a Chinese virus. When we look at the manifestation of statements like that to the rest of the community, what is it really implying? And that there is no difference if somebody says that this is a Chinese virus to whether it's Chinese or Korean, because a lot of people don't really, can identify the difference, right? The pool is the same. So what is the kind of impact then to the Asian American community? First, by not acknowledging and honoring that there are those differences. And two, when these kind of stereotypic comments are made that are very detrimental to the community in general.
Yeah, so I have two thoughts. So one, I think it's very, very dangerous whenever there's something like a pandemic or something that is abstract and scary to lump it with any group. Because what happens is, because for example, let's say I don't know the difference between the different Asian communities. Anybody with black hair, Asian looking eyes, anybody that looks like they may be of Asian descent, I'm going to lump them into, they probably have COVID-19, because our brains want to work in ways where we can just develop schemas or groups, right? So we can just slot things in easily, because especially when we are scared or stressed out, we don't want to spend a lot of time trying to think and distinguish what are the small, slight, differences, because we just want to feel safer and we just don't have the mental capacity. So the dangerousness of saying, okay, here's something scary and something we don't know, and let's just lump it with this group of people that, may be different from ourselves to make it a little bit easier for us to identify potential risks to ourselves. That's going to result in the whole entire world discriminating against, attacking aggressively, and, really not providing even the same level of care to that group of people. And so this is something that has been occurring throughout history. It just so happens that with COVID-19, Asian people were the target, right? When you think about Ebola, you think about AIDS, like anybody can think about those pandemics and think about, oh, there were groups of people, whether it be a race or LGBTQ, like that were lumped into the identifiable way of saying, okay, we can't see the virus, so let's just lump it with a group of people that we can definitely say, okay, yep, that must be somebody who is a carrier. So that's something that we do, and it's so dangerous to do that. So that's one thing. Now the other thing is, it is especially tricky because when you start to say, oh, it's the Chinese virus, and then you have the rest of the world attacking all Asian people, then you start to split Asian communities, right? So you have, for example, Asian people saying, well, I'm not Chinese, right? I'm not Chinese, so stop attacking me. That's not helpful. That's not helpful, because what you're doing is you're perpetuating that stigma, and you're just distancing yourself from what's actually going on. The trouble is, we can't say this is a Chinese virus, or it's the Chinese's fault, and then all of a sudden say, well, but I'm not Chinese, so don't group me in there. You should learn to tell the difference. That's not a helpful thing for us to do. So it separates Asian people, actually. So it actually divides Asian communities against itself. And that is the second part that I think becomes very dangerous.
Yeah. I love that you're bringing that up, and even your example about like Ebola and HIV/AIDS, because I think that for a long time, it was connected to the African American community and to the African community. And I remember when the rise in terms of awareness about COVID started coming out, a lot of Black folks were like, thank God it ain't us this time, um, and you saw that reaction. But I want to talk about that in connection to what you just said. There's sort of like this conquer and divide mentality that's happening with statements like that within the Asian community, and then between the Asian community and other minority groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk about the danger of that, right? Because I've seen reports of, Asian Americans being attacked by a variety of different kinds of people, even other groups of color. And then most recently, there are some articles that have been coming out about Asians in China, or Chinese people saying that they want Africans out of their country. So what is this beef all about? Like, what is this issue that the different, minority, and I'm saying that in quotes because, that's relative, right? Like, people of color are not the world minority, we're the world majority and have always been. And as this pandemic sort of ravages the world, we become more connected as a global community. What do you think where does that come from? How do we deal with it as people of color?
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about that?
So I think there's so much history there, and layers, right? So I think at the very top of the layers is resources. I think that we, especially marginalized communities, are led to believe that there is limited resources of power, of authority, and so we are allocated only so much. So now we have to fight among each other for those resources, for one, right? The other one is, I think that, growing up in the US and being educated in the US, working in the US, there is this very like America-centric perspective that we take. And so I think that we need to separate that from what's going on globally. And so when I think about the different layers, right, I think at the very, very broad level, there is this common like white-centered, anything white is the standard, right? And then anything that has to do with that is like skin pigmentation. No matter where you go in the world, it seems that if you're lighter skinned, it's preferred. In Asia, in like Africa, in South America, all over the place, it's like the lighter you are, the better you are. So there is that bias. But then also the history in, for example, like in China and other Asian histories, and their race differences and how they see race is a little bit different than the US. So okay. I want to start with first focusing on the United States.
Okay.
I think the relationship between Asian communities and Black communities has so much history between it. There's been a lot of times where the Asian communities and Black communities have come together to really fight for each other and to be there for one another. And there's also a lot of separation and divide. And I think it goes back to my first point about there's this perception that there's limited resources. So, for example, let's say in a workplace, right, in an office building, if there's only one promotion opportunity for one role, and you have like an Asian person and a Black person, right, then they're going to be going up against each other, and then all the history of their races is going to play in line. For example, the Asian community, the Asian candidate might be like, okay, well, I'm more pull in. They may pull in a lot of the racist narrative of this country that they've learned about the Black community, and then the same goes for the potential Black candidate, where that person might pull in all of the racist narrative about the Asian person, and they use those narratives created by white people and people in power against each other.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's something that is going on, and it gets replayed. And then I think when pressures come on, like, you know, being afraid of this virus, then it's easy to resort to that, and it's harder to fight against that. And especially for people who've been marginalized for a long time, you know, you don't want to be grouped in another marginalized and feared group. And so it's easy to fall into that.
It's almost like there's this hierarchy of, like, you know, I mean, a lot of people have talked about it from the idea of the oppression Olympics, like, you know, what are the hierarchies of marginalization? And as long as I'm not at the bottom of that, you know, like, I may be marginalized, okay, you know, I'm not white and I don't get all the privileges of white people, but at least, you know, like, the stereotype around the Asian community is that, like, you know, Asians are smart, they're mostly doctors, they are very studious, they, you know, have a strong work ethic, right? And then, you know, versus like some of the stereotypes that are put out there, you know, by, like you said, that this American-centric, white-centric sort of worldview, which is like, oh, Black people are lazy, or, you know, they don't want to work as hard. Everybody's on welfare, you know, which when we look at the facts, those are not the facts, right? Like,
right.
The facts are, you know, but the facts are not the propaganda that's put out there. It's the narrative that, you know, those in power want us to believe about one another. Mm-hmm. And that creates this unbelievable division. Do you think that the Black and Asian community has been more divided than they have been together? Like, one of the things that I think about is, like, you know, the beauty industry, for example. And the fact that the majority of the beauty stores, you know, are owned by, well, also originated from, like, Koreans, right? And but that there's a very large hold from you know, the Asian American owners of beauty salons and beauty stores, and that their major consumer are the African American community, right? Like a $1 trillion industry, right? Like, African Americans by far are the majority feeders of income into the beauty industry. Yet there is a lack of cohesiveness or capacity to work together. And I think that the stereotypes continue to be perpetuated, right? Nail salons, the same kind of thing. What are your thoughts about that? Because that definitely has been something that it's there. There's a tension that absolutely exists, and people are not talking about it. They're just not.
Yeah. So my thought is there is a system at play, and the system is far more powerful than any group of people. We're actually being puppeted, right? And there are puppeteers. And so you are right. And I think that, you know, there is a lot of tension, especially when you talk about economic opportunities and stakeholders, right? And so there's a lot of tension, and I think it goes back to the system. So if you're familiar with Paulo Freire's work, he wrote a really, really great book about the pedagogy of oppression, right? And so it's this system that is so much more powerful than any of us, and it's been in play for decades, centuries even, where people who may have been marginalized and oppressed, they start out saying, this feels bad, it feels wrong, I'm going to rise up against this, and I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to change the system. And they fight. And eventually, for those that actually make it to the top to try to change the system, they get a taste of that power and that authority. So, like, for example, in the beauty industry, right, all of a sudden they have all this money. Now they don't want to share it. And so
Right.
because that system is so powerful, it's this capitalistic, like, I want to make money, I want to succeed system. Once you're on the top, are you willing to risk losing
Mm,
that to spread it among the other people that where you started out? And what happens is a lot of people lose sight of that, right? So they rise to the top, they lose sight of where they came from, who they are, why they're doing this, and it feels so much better. So then they're not willing to actually carry out on their original goal. And so I
mm,
think it's that system. And I think it's important that we talk about that system, because when we realize that it's that system, then we're not fighting each other, we're fighting the
yeah,
system. And we
right.
need to remember that. That's how we stay together, and that's how we continue to work together to build these bridges that, where the gaps were created for a reason. It's to keep us divided. It's to
Yeah.
keep us separated, because if we actually see what's going on and we continue to work together, then we
Can you
can
imagine?
actually, right? And so it's the system. And I think, we need to remember that. And it's hard to get that message out, because we feel, as individuals, we feel so hurt and so betrayed by, other people of color, other people that have been marginalized, people in power, that we want to get what's ours. And so we lose sight of, like, what is the issue here?
Absolutely. I love that. I mean, I think that it, from a behavioral, cognition standpoint, it really begins to identify how psychologically we have bought in to this idea that somehow if we make it, we have to completely separate ourselves from anything else that may connect us or associate us with being marginalized. And possibly because the struggle was so impactful that finally making it, whatever that means for different communities, different people in those communities, is like, there's this cognitive dissonance that says I can't even fathom going back to that, even if it means helping out my brothers or sisters in the struggle. Because the idea is that we are really all in a struggle. It may
Mhm.
look different for all of us, but we're all participating in this struggle, in this rat race in one way or another.
Mhm.
Um, and your point that if we were to unite, it would be a real unstoppable type of thing. And I honestly don't know what the catalyst event needs to be for that to occur. There is so much power and creativity and talent and amazing leadership that are held between our communities, and we just really haven't been able to get it together for
Mhm.
generations to do this. What would be, as we are kind of winding down, what would be some of your suggestions, particularly for communities of color? I'd love for you to address the Asian community first, because I know that mental health and the stigma of seeking treatment is big.
Mhm.
Um, and what that looks like in terms of shame for themselves and for their families. But how do we push past that, understanding that this is a global traumatic event, right? This is the biggest existential crisis in our humanity at this point in our lifetime. What do we need to do to take care of ourselves? Our anxiety, the depression that's going to spawn from this, the trauma that's going to spawn from this, and all of those other mental health issues that will creep up if we don't handle, acknowledge, and take care of them.
Yeah. I think starting with the Asian community, I think one of the things that I would like to see happen is for the Asian community to be more receptive of some of um, the various ways of coping with the fear, the trauma, and the anxiety right now.
Mhm.
I think it's really easy for us to cast judgment, against each other. Like, that person's angry, they're not coping right. That person is, for example, that person's denying like denying that COVID-19 is a real thing. They think that it's like this fake thing. We all deal with this sense of powerlessness so differently. And I think that's what's really coming about with this traumatic pandemic is that, you know, with trauma, with any trauma, people feel powerless. And when
Yeah.
you feel powerless, what you do is you try to take control or you relinquish all control, right? So it's kind of this like black or white. I'm going to control everything in my environment. I'm going to go buy guns. I'm going to go and like defend myself against any potential threat with this virus and with the racism that's going on against the Asian community. And that's really a trauma reaction. You
Yeah.
know, by no means am I saying like sit back and just take whatever is thrown at you. I think that there's so much cognitive dissonance. There's so much tension, I think, right now in the Asian community too, because there is this bias or the stereotype that Asian people are, you know, submissive or passive. And
Yeah.
so there are people who are saying like, forget that, I'm going to show you just how, you know, capable and aggressive I can be. So there's this like desire to push against this bias and stereotype. And then there's also this feeling of not only am I struggling with fearing this virus, but like I'm afraid to go to the grocery store. I'm afraid to walk around the block in my own neighborhood. I don't know who I can trust. And so it's a multi-layered trauma. And I want the Asian community to be more vocal about this, to talk with friends and family about this, to be willing to even seek therapy, to
Yeah.
even talk through this. I think a common mistake for anybody is they don't seek therapy until they feel like I really need it, which is usually way after they need it, right? And
Yeah.
we know, right? We know that therapy is oftentimes really helpful before you feel like desperate for
Exactly.
help. So
Yeah.
I guess I want people to even just dip their toe into therapy right now, especially with telemedicine right now. You can do that so easily
Yeah.
outside of your own home.
Yeah, such easy access. That's right. Telemedicine has created a world of difference. It has removed every single barrier to seeking treatment. At this point, you don't have to be ashamed to wait in a waiting room because there's no one else in your space except you, or that anyone else will see you seeking treatment. You can do it from the privacy of your own home or your own space or go outside or whatever it is, right? You can have access to anybody at this point. I think that they've even changed the boundaries of where psychologists can practice. So I would like to invite the audience that if they're hearing this message and they need treatment, and specifically the Asian American community, and if you're Hmong and if you are struggling in any kind of way, so someone who even culturally understands you, that you reach out to Dr. Vang. So can you share with us what are the ways in which people can follow you, hear your message? I know you have been very busy in the media right now, talking about xenophobia, being an unbelievable advocate in our community, an amazing psychologist that is breaking this down to the elements of the human experience. And I want you to share with them how they can get in touch with you if they need one-on-one treatment or however that works, consultation. If there are organizations that need you to support them getting through this crisis and need you to consult with them on how to do this from the lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion, how can they get in touch with you so that they're doing this in an informed way as opposed to slapping something together that's probably not going to work?
Yeah, thank you for that. I invite people to come and check out my YouTube page, Dr.Talee Vang. I invite people to come and check out my Facebook page, Dr.Talee Vang. I love to consult, whether it's individually for organizations or large corporations. One of the things that I'm doing right now is even talking to leaders in the front lines. So a lot of the medical leaders about how to talk with employees about the difficulty of not wanting to come into work. I mean, there's this huge topic of moral injury, moral pain. How do I continue to do this work when I'm scared about these things, yet I committed myself to this field. So there's so many different things. And then I want to say diversity issues are always always a part of these conversations and discussions, right? It's not a separate thing. And so I welcome questions. I welcome conversation. I'm so grateful that you and I, Dr. Akbar, have had this conversation about the different communities, like the Black community and the Asian community, because I think that those things are not often discussed and brought up, because, you know, we crave movement so much and unity so much that I think that there's this fear to engage in these difficult dialogues. So I invite people to continue to have these conversations. And if they're interested in conversing with me about this, you know, I'm very open to that as well.
I love that. I love that. So they should follow you on your social media. And then if they want to get in contact with you, they can direct message you, IM you, or DM you, and then you can respond that way. Is that the best way? Do you have a website or anything that, you know, that I can reference for them, or anything of the sort that they can go to communicate with you more directly, or is this the best way to do it?
I think the best way to do it is to message me through the Facebook page right
Perfect.
now.
Perfect. I really like that as we're ending, and perhaps you and I should talk about opening up like a community conversation about the relationship between the Black and the Asian community. I think that would be a really deep, needed conversation. Some things that we can probably demystify and challenge in terms of people's thinking, and perhaps take this to a different platform. I'm so grateful for you coming on and sharing your expertise and your knowledge with my community. I know that they are definitely gonna follow you and support you. And you know, thank you again, and we'll keep doing this work.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
No problem. All right, y'all. Until next